In the early part of the 18th century, the Middletown Valley area west of Frederick was a vast wilderness occupied by the native aboriginal tribes of the Iroquois, the Susquehannocks, the Catawbas, and the Delawares. Shortly after the first Lutheran church was established at Jerusalem, just north of present-day Myersville, the first settler, Frederick Lauber, built his log cabin on the Indian Trail leading to the Shenandoah by way of Crampton's Gap. Here, Lauber established his gunsmith shop and immediately prospered. English and German settlers began arriving by 1740 and formed a settlement around Lauber's smith shop and clearing that became known as Smithfield. The original Indian Trail along what is now Walnut Street was known at this time as the Old Canaan Road. This is a biblical reference, likely because along this road the first church structure was built for the area. This first church was occupied by both the Lutherans and the German Reformed. The name Canaan for this area was still in use until the middle of the 20th century. In 1748, a young Lieutenant George Washington passed by the Smithfield House as he surveyed the South Mountain region, at which time he noted that the valley to the east was one of the most beautiful places he had ever seen. As Indian hostilities increased leading up to the French and Indian War, in 1755 George Washington returned to the area as an aide-de-camp to General Braddock as they marched past the Smithfield House on their way to that fateful Battle of Monongahela at Fort Duquesne. Beyond the Smithfield House, the area became home to early and important industries that supported the many farmers of the Middletown Valley, including a creamery and the Appleman Tannery, established just to the east of the Smithfield House. The tannery processed animal skins into workable leather. This process required large numbers of trees to supply tannin as well as a reliable source of fresh water. Tanner's Branch still runs behind the Smithfield House and is fed from an underground spring at the existing spring house and down to Catoctin Creek. The surrounding area was now called Middletown and was rich in agriculture and continued to prosper well into the mid-19th century. In the fall of 1862, the Civil War came to the area as the Southern General Longstreet's Corps, commanded by D.H. Hill, marched past the Smithfield House to defend the passes of South Mountain against the Federal Army of General McClellan. The wounded of the Battle of South Mountain and the engagement a few days later at Antietam were hospitalized in Middletown. Those wounded, that included the future President Rutherford B. Hayes, were hospitalized in a home just up the street from the Smithfield House, and many more were housed at the Appleman Tannery buildings next door. Over the years, the Smithfield House was passed down and sold to a number of families, being owned by the Smith family in the late 1800s, and then in 1904 it was sold to Otho Shoemaker. In 1915, Calvin and Lola Gladhill moved their furniture and funeral business from Myersville to Middletown at the site of the original tannery next to the Smithfield House. In 1943, the Gladhill family purchased the Smithfield House from the heirs of Otho Shoemaker.
We're in the entrance to Smithfield House, which is the oldest house in Middletown. The original property, the very first, might have been next door. I think the original foundation is there, and this is probably the next house. It's called Smithfield House in honor of the original name of Middletown, which was Smithfield. You can see it's not a large house, but it's a stone house, and the architectural elements are not typical of a house of this size and of this period. It's outstanding woodwork. An example is this door with the multiple panels. It's not typical of a cross and Bible door. It has extra panels. The entrance has panels, which is not typical of a house of this period. So whoever did it must have had the talent or the money to have it done. The Manels are outstanding examples of woodwork for that period. When my grandmother owned the house, she never lived here, but she bought it as a rental property because it was adjoining the furniture company. And she was offered many times, people wanted to buy the manels and the staircase and tear them out, and of course she wouldn't allow that to happen. This also is a warming cupboard next to the fireplace. I guess they either kept food or clothing in there to keep it warm from being next to the chimney. Also, I forgot to tell you about the carpenter locks, which are on all the doors in the building, which are typical of this period of house, late 1700s. This is a typical cross and Bible door, and you can see the cross and the Bible. And I was told many years ago in studying architecture that it was designed this way to keep evil spirits away. And this also was an example of a carpenter lock. Had a brass, probably.
The Smithfield House was originally a basic log structure built on a stone foundation. In the late 1700s, the logs were replaced by stone, using the original chestnut logs as timbers for the construction of the floors, roof, and the cantilevered porch. The architecture is the classic Pennsylvania German traditional of the early 18th century. Built into the bank, there is an at-grade entrance to the upper floor in the front, as well as to the lower floor in the back. Note that the fireplace chimneys are in the interior of the walls, and each living area has a fireplace for heating, with a large fireplace on the first level for cooking in the winter. The Smithfield House has 4 rooms on each level with high ceilings. Note the craftsmanship of the finishes on the fireplace mantels. In the bedroom, there still exist the original pegs that were used to hang garments. The Smithfield House has the added feature of an outside porch on the second level that extends the width of the house. This porch was cantilevered using the original chestnut logs for support. The staircase to the attic and the first floor still has the original woodwork, and the flooring of the upper level is original from the native chestnut forest of the region in the 1700s. At the back of the Smithfield House, we still have the original spring house with hand-hewn rafter supports carved into the beautiful chestnut exposed at the southern end. Originally, there was also a summer kitchen and a small barn that was used as a stable and later as a livery. This was raised in the 1960s to make room for the parking area behind.
We're standing outside the back of the Smithfield House, and this is the spring house, which has a lot of the original material in it. We've often thought that this house, the spring house, might even predate the Smithfield House just because of the way it's built. It could be part of the original property that was the very first property in Middletown. This is Smithfield House is the oldest, but this could even be older. When I was a child, there was actually a wash house summer kitchen that was behind the spring house. It was like a story and a half with windows on the sides, and then their barn was behind that. We always used it for storage, but I guess it was a working barn at one time. It wasn't as large as most barns, but it was probably a stable for the horses.